So Frank decided he was going to sell Serializer as a seminar, a live event. And this is the thing. Frank had never done a live event. I mean, he had done the thing with Ed Dale, but Ed Dale had basically put all of that together. So Frank had never done a live event on his own. And he decided he was going to sell this for $10,000. And Frank didn't have any, he really wasn't known in the internet marketing community, and he didn't even know if it would sell. As a matter of fact, Frank didn't even really have much of a list. The only list that Frank really had was a list of like 6,000 people from where he had done the event with Ed Dale. And so Frank is so scared this won't work, he wouldn't even email the whole list. And what Frank does is he sends out an offer for Serializer for $10,000 to 3,000 people on that list. And he sold 50 of those in 4 minutes. He made $500,000 in 4 minutes. An hour later, he sent the offer to the other 3,000 people, and he sold 50 more in 50 minutes. And what ultimately happened here is Frank made $1 million in 1 hour, basically, in 54 minutes. He didn't have any affiliates because he was marketing it to his own list. So he got to keep all of the money, and the money was paid in advance. Frank was so scared when he did Serializer live that he had a Xanax in his front pocket. He was scared people wouldn't like it. They would ask for refunds, and he gave them lots of gifts when they came in. And Serializer was basically teaching people, I guess, how to go into a niche market and then be able to market to all sections of that niche. So you could do this in the sporting industry, you could probably do it in the automobile industry, you could do it in all these industries, but it was taking a niche, getting something that worked, and then marketing throughout all different subsects of that niche. And so Frank made the $1 million. And then he came home after doing the seminar, and Frank was reading People magazine, and he read a story about Neil Strauss. Neil Strauss was a writer for the Rolling Stone, and Neil had written a book called The Game. The Game was about dating advice and picking up women in bars. Now, what was interesting about this whole story is Frank was really good friends with Dean Jackson. And Dean Jackson was really good friends with Eben Pagan, and Eben Pagan owned Double Your Dating. And so Frank runs out and buys the book because he knows a guy who's in the industry, and he's thinking maybe Neil will mention Eben Pagan in this book. And so Frank reads the book, and he thinks the book is very good, and he gives the book to his cousin Trey Smith and says, "Trey, you should read this. It's a pretty good book." Trey reads the book and comes back to Frank and says, "Frank, we need to get a hold of Neil Strauss. We need to tell Neil Strauss to do a seminar and then sell that, the tapes, and record that, and then create a product to sell, and we could all make a lot of money." And Frank says, "Why would Neil Strauss ever work with us? Who are we? Nobody knows who we are." And Neil Strauss is probably, Harvard educated or something, has written several bestsellers, writes for the Rolling Stone, very professional person. And Frank basically says, "Why would this guy ever work with us?" Well, somehow, someone in Serializer who had bought the Serializer method found out that Frank wouldn't mind doing this, and that person knew Neil Strauss. That person went to Neil Strauss and said, "Neil, you need to contact Frank and Trey. They could help you to make a lot of money. You might want to have a conversation with them." And so Neil Strauss actually calls Frank Kern. And this is what Frank says to him. Frank says, "Well, I think that you should do a high-end seminar, and I'm not sure if that would work. But you should do a high-end seminar, and then you should record the high-end seminar, and then we should create an information product and sell that information product to a bunch of people. And I don't know if that will work, but I think it could work, and I think if it works, we could make some money." And Neil Strauss says yes. Now, Frank has never, now this is the non-internet marketing community that they're marketing to. They sell 30 seats to a seminar for $8,000 a seat. And the whole point of so they make 240 grand on the front end, but the whole point of this is just to record the seminar. They record the seminar and they turn it into an information marketing product, and they call it the Annihilation Method. They release the Annihilation Method. They're charging $3,600 for that, and they make $1.4 million in 4 hours. They sell 500 of it, and I think they strictly limited it to 500 orders, and they split that money for 3 ways. And so Frank had now a situation where he had made money with Adele. He'd made money on his own product, the serializer method. Now he's made money with the Annihilation Method. And Frank was living in Macon, Georgia, and he was living in the nicest house there. And I think at this time, the dog business that he has, the niche dog business, is bringing in around $600,000 or $700,000 a year. He's making probably as much money in his area. He's living in the nicest home, thinking about moving to California. And he gets a call from Mike Long, and Frank was friends with Mike. And Mike says, you know, I've got some friends of mine, and they want you to help them with the launch because they heard what you did with Neil. And Frank says, what do they want to do? And Mike says they want to do a $10 million product launch on a product called StomperNet. And the people are Andy Jenkins and Brad Fallon. And Frank, for a couple of different reasons, didn't want to do it. He just didn't want to, but he liked Mike, and he was a friend of Mike's, and he didn't want to tell Mike no. So what Frank did is Frank said, you know what? If they give me $25,000 up front, I'll do it. That's the only way I'll work with them. And this is the internet marketing community. He's saying he wants $25,000 up front. He's had one success. He's not well known in the industry. Frank doesn't think he'll hear from these people ever again. 4 days later, they send him a check for 25 grand. They say, let's go. And so Frank hires his cousin, brings his cousin in, and for 90 days, they work on the StomperNet launch. And the StomperNet launch ultimately does $18 million in 24 hours. Now, this is the thing. It doesn't do $18 million consecutively. And that money is being paid over time because a lot of these people are actually paying by the month. So they're signing up for a subscription service. So they would turn the shopping cart on for 2 hours and they would sell, and then they would shut it off. And a few hours later, they would turn it back on, and they would have it on for 2 hours and shut it off because they didn't want to crash their servers in the middle of this major launch. But at the end of the day, StomperNet did around $10.2 million. I think that's the amount of money they brought in from it. And this made Frank somewhat famous in the marketplace. And while Frank only made $25,000 up front, that's the only money he got paid for StomperNet. They did hire him as a consultant. He did some work with them. And while Frank was flying back and forth, Frank decided he was going to become an internet sensation, become famous in a niche, and make a lot of money. And he decided this. It was all going to be by design. And so Frank decided he was going to move to California. And he was spending a lot of time in California. And what happened here, and I think this is extremely important, is Frank was hanging around a lot of people who were making $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, $4 million a year. So while Frank was, in Macon, Georgia, as high as it gets, Frank was in a group of people in California now where $600,000 a year wasn't that much money. And he was also looking at buying a home in California. And so what happened, while he was looking for a home to buy, he accidentally found a house he decided to buy to renovate. So he buys this house for $1.4 million, and he's going to spend $1 million renovating it. Then he finds another house to buy that he's wanting to live in. And so what he found was that income that he was making wasn't going to be enough to continue the lifestyle in California. And Frank decided to create a product, and he created a product called Mass Control. And he released Mass Control, and Mass Control did $12 million. Now, unfortunately, while it did $12 million, half of that money went to affiliates. He had another 20% in refunds. He had a Mass Control seminar that cost him a few $100,000. And when it was all said and done, Frank made around $4 million or something like that, $4.4 million on Mass Control. And then he coasted along in California for like a year and a half, and then he decided to release Mass Control 2.0. And when he released Mass Control 2.0, it was a lot of the same thing that happened before. Very big launch. They did a few $1 million, but what happened, by the time the affiliates and the returns came in and all that, Frank only made like $600,000 for Mass Control 2.0. But Frank knew that he wasn't going to make a lot of money this time. And he had everything built on out to make more money. So Mass Control wasn't created to make a lot of money. Mass Control was to build a big list. And the people who bought Mass Control came to the seminar. And at the seminar, he sold a variety of coaching. And he made several $100,000 from that. He sold Mass Control monthly, and he made several $100,000 from that. He sold a mastermind, and he made several $100,000 from that. And when it all came down to the bottom line, Frank made $600,000 on the front end and like $2.4 million on the back end, and that money was all Frank's. He wasn't sharing that money with anyone. That was all money that he got to keep, and that was all by design. Everything that he did there was actually done on purpose. So the next thing that happened is Frank created a product called the Millionaire Marketing Formulas with Brandon Burchard. They sold that event for like $10,000, and they either sold 50 or 100 seats. And what the Millionaire Marketing Formulas was Frank and Brandon Burchard were going to put people into a room and show them every launch that they had done that had done $1 million, and basically break every launch down. And while they were at this event and doing this event, Kevin Nations had signed up for the Millionaire Marketing Formulas. And Kevin was already doing over $1 million a year coaching. And Kevin and Frank got to talking, and they ended up doing a product together called One Man Millions. And it was basically teaching people how to get leads, get those people onto the phone and do strategy sessions and sell coaching. And they did very, very well with that. And I think they did that for about a year, and they sold ongoing coaching. And then Frank decided to kind of go his own way and do some other things, because Frank was now in a position where he wanted to sell higher dollar. He wanted to sell higher end coaching, work with more established business owners. And he was just seeing the way things were progressing. And then what happened, Trey Smith had a friend that they hung out with. And this guy had a list of 700 people. And the most the 700 people had ever spent was like $79. And they decided they were going to sell this group of people something that cost many thousands of dollars. And so they launched this product to a list of 700 people who'd never spent more than $79, and they made hundreds of thousands of dollars. And when Trey Smith heard about that, Trey Smith did the same thing. He released a product and did $1.5 million really, really fast. And this was a competition and peer pressure thing. And so Frank created a product called the High Paid Advisor Model. And Frank was going to teach that as a seminar in a weekend. He was going to sell it for $10,000, and he was going to sell 150 seats of this. So in the middle of October, Frank releases this product and starts sending emails for this product, and he sells 65 seats in just a few days. And he has the seminar in December, and he makes $650,000 on the seminar. in basically 45 days from the idea to the actually selling of the seminar. And what Frank decided at this point was that he was only going to focus on the highest end of the market, sell at 10,000 to 50,000 or 100,000. And so Frank started doing this high-paid advisor model, and he started doing these things as lead generation, and he was selling those for anywhere from $8,500 to $9,700, and they were 8-week courses with live question and answer, very similar to the One Man Millions model. But what would happen is when people bought that, on the back end, Frank would sell coaching at anywhere from $39,000 to $100,000 if you were working with him one-on-one. And so that's basically where Frank went to. And Frank, at one point, I think he said his overhead is $130,000 a month. But he said that, if you're selling something that's 10 grand and your overhead's only $130,000 a month, you only need 13 buyers. And when you sell at the high end of the market, if you're only selling to 13 people, you can give those people a lot more value and spend a lot more time with them. And so what Frank essentially said was that he wasn't going to do product launches anymore. He wasn't going to do affiliate marketing anymore. He wasn't going to do packaged product anymore. And he was going to do high-end consulting. And that is what Frank does now. That's essentially where Frank is. Frank does the high-paid advisor model. It's a lead generation thing to get people into the fold so that he can sell high-end coaching. And what that model looks like is very simple. Facebook ads to a webinar. The webinar gets people to agree to a strategy session or agree to buy the high-paid advisor model at $9,700. And everyone who buys that gets a free ticket to come and hang out with Frank for a weekend. So they do a live seminar. At the live seminar, Frank sells ongoing coaching. And that's kind of what the model looks like. And now, because Frank is famous in a niche, a lot of people actually seek Frank out. And he's very, very high end. He's got his hand in a lot of different businesses in the internet marketing space. And a lot of what Frank is doing now is he's building what we would call legacy rather than income. So a lot of the work Frank is doing now is getting a percentage of the ownership in a business rather than getting a monthly fee. Very, very similar to what Jay Abraham does now as well. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end out of this. I really hope I brought some value to you today. I hope you see the progression of everything that happened. There are so many takeaways from this story. I think the big takeaway is the thing that he did with Neil Strauss. He said he didn't know if it would make money, but he said we could try it and see what happened. Frank, he was very fortunate at that because the Neil Strauss thing worked. The people at StomperNet wanted to work with him. And he's very fortunate they actually sent him the 25 grand because he could have missed that opportunity. And in my opinion, the StomperNet opportunity created the opportunity to do mass control. And then the other thing that had a big effect on all of this was moving from Georgia to California and being around all of those people who were making large amounts of money in the space. It was no longer acceptable just to make $500,000 or $750,000 a year. So, like I said, I hope you got some value from this today. I do appreciate you watching it, and thanks a lot.